Hello and welcome to Stupid Ancient History, Stupid Exam Skills. Today we're going to look at the 20-mark essay question on the period study exam paper, which is of course Persian Kings and Foundations of Rome. And as always, a little disclaimer, this is not the only way to approach this question. This is not necessarily something specified by OCR. This is just techniques and tips that I've found particularly useful for students doing GCSE. There are probably other ways to do this, and of course if your actual teacher tells you to do it a different way, listen to your teacher rather than some random weirdo on the internet. But that aside, let's carry on and look at the 20-mark exam questions. So let's have a look at the exam paper and find out where this cheeky 20-mark question comes. Obviously, as always, I'm using the sample assessment materials available on the OCR website. So on your screen now, you'll see the sample version of the Persian Kings exam paper, the period study. And there it is, right at the bottom, snuck in at the bottom, Persians treated the peoples they conquered well. How far do you agree with this statement? 20 marks. Now you'll also see it gets an extra 5 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar. So this is the last question on the period exam paper, but don't forget it's not the end of the exam, because once you've done the periods section you're going to have to go on and do a depth study paper, so don't spend too long on it. Right then, so let's begin with what this exam question wants and also what it doesn't want. So for 20 marks, arguably, or you could suggest that this question is easier than the previous question, easier than the 15-mark question, because it's asking you to technically do a lot less. Realistically, you don't have to involve sources, you don't have to use different skills. It's relatively straightforward. It's mainly asking you to evaluate a view. Most of these questions come with a how far do you agree, so you need to obviously agree with the statement, give evidence to support it, offer a counter argument or disagree with the statement, and ultimately come to a judgment. You'll notice on the paper as well there's a little asterisk next to the question. That asterisk means you will also be assessed on the quality of your written argument, which means yes, you do need an introduction, and more importantly you do need a conclusion. Additionally, there's an extra 5 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar. So as long as you can get through this relatively well, that's to some extent extra free 5 marks. However, saying what it's quite straightforward and quite simple, structurally it is, but for 20 marks the level of support that you need to give to your arguments should be significant, and ideally should be specific and detailed wherever possible. And as we've said before, wherever possible, depending on what the question is, you should cover as much of the breadth of the course as you possibly can. So in the case of the Persians, in this one, ideally you need to cover all 4 Persian kings in some way or shape or another. You may not want to give equal coverage to each king depending on the question, but it's important that for a period study you cover the whole period. Now, before you start actually writing this question, for this question particularly, it is important to do a plan. For a question this broad, you're going to need to think about it. Now, obviously time is tight in an exam. It doesn't need to be detailed, it only needs to be a brief plan, but you do need it to stay on track. One danger with this kind of question is that you do end up just going off on a tangent and you lose track of where your argument's going. Again, don't forget you're going to be writing this after you've just done the majority of the period study paper, so you'll probably need to do a plan just to refocus yourself. Now the plan I'm suggesting is very simple, very straightforward. It's the example on the screen. It's a simple agree, disagree plan. And to cover this, ideally you're looking for 3, maybe 4 good developed points on either side. Again, if you're trying to cover the full range of, in this case, Persian kings, you might want to do 1 point for each king on either side. But do bear in mind there is a time limit to this, because you've got another whole section to do once you've finished this question. So as always, It's not a perfect plan for all questions. There may be instances where this plan may need some tweaking or rethinking, but generally this plan fits the majority of large essay questions that OCR have asked for the new spec and arguably the old spec. It's a tried and tested formula. So let's look at an example. So again, as I've said before, this is like all the others. This is from the specimen paper available on the OCR website. So it's a good one to have handy while you're listening to this video. So the question is, the Persians treated the peoples they conquered well. How far do you agree with this statement? So again, we've got the basic plan on the screen, but for the purpose of this video, I've added a few extra boxes. I've added an introduction and a conclusion. Realistically, in the exam, you won't have time to be worrying about this. You should know what to write for an introduction by this point, and arguably before you even write the question, you'll know where you fit in this argument. You'll decide whether all Persian kings or some Persian kings or no Persian kings treated the people they conquered well. So the introduction and conclusion box is simply there for this video. I would suggest in the actual exam you don't really need this. So I've already started pre-populating this argument. If you look on this plan on the screen, I've already filled in a brief introduction. Ultimately, your introduction should restate the question, but ideally outline the argument where you're going to go with this, so it's not a surprise to the examiner. Your introduction and conclusion should roughly mirror each other. It shouldn't be a surprise where you're going with this. So then the next obvious point is to add some examples to this agree section. So on the screen I've got 5 examples here. This may be more than you could get done in 20 minutes. It depends on how quickly you're writing, but I thought I'd give more examples than possibly necessary just to flesh out this argument. So this is a very chronological approach. If you look, the examples given follow chronological order. Now if we're looking at the Persians treating the people they conquered well, the obvious point to start with and the early point to start with is Cyrus. So I've started with Cyrus's approach, particularly to the religions of the people he conquered. This is quite a good one to start with. The fact that Cyrus doesn't mess with people's religion. Arguably you could link this to his success, but here we've got the good examples of his treatment of the Jews when he takes Babylon. He gives them money to build a temple, he effectively frees them, allows them to do what they want. I've also suggested on here his dealings with the Greek gods when he takes Lydia. So particularly the example we'd be looking at is when Croesus is about to be burned on the pyre. There's some mention of Apollo and a rainstorm, and Cyrus seems dutifully humble in the face of the Greek gods. Even though they're not his gods, he is obedient to them. He treats them well. The second point I've added on, again it's Cyrus the Great, and again it's Lydia, so it follows the chronology nicely, is this idea that Cyrus ends the sacking of cities after he takes Lydia. We have this example where Croesus questions Cyrus about what his men are doing as they're running around the city, stripping of all its wealth and presumably burning the houses and enslaving the people. And he makes the point of, well, this is your city now, so what are you doing? And Cyrus goes, yeah, that's a good idea, never thought of it that way, and effectively he ends sacking. Now this is a big deal in the ancient world, because normally when a city was taken, it was sacked, which was generally unpleasant for everyone involved. So we could say this is a good example of him treating the people well. The people knew that if Cyrus took the city, they'd be relatively safe. You can of course come up with lots of other examples with Cyrus, particularly his treatment of enemy kings. Astyages, Croesus and so on, they're all made advisors rather than having terrible things done to them. But for the purpose of this one, I'm moving straight on to our next king, which is Cambyses. And I've particularly picked out on one instance here. This is Ujarhorosnet's description of Cambyses as a king. This goes in contrast to Herodotus' account of Cambyses, but Ujarhorosnet ultimately says Cambyses was pretty good to the Egyptians. He ruled well, and he interred the Apis bull with all the right ceremonies. We'll come back to this idea in a minute. Then swiftly moving on to Darius, we can talk about Darius's attitude to, well, what he describes as truth and liars. It's enshrined on the Behistun inscription. This idea that if you are loyal and do what he wants you to do, you will get off quite lightly. You will benefit from this. The example here I've used is his treatment of most of the Ionian states that rebelled against him, that following the rebellion they were generally treated quite well. It was a case of no harm, no foul, let's just move on. If you look at people like the island of Lesbos particularly, they benefited quite well after the Battle of Lade. So Darius fits into this model quite well. And then finally, the last one, I've combined Darius and Xerxes together, particularly looking at this idea of offering earth and water to the Greeks that they were about to invade. Again, this idea that if you offer them earth and water, you will easily transition into the Persian Empire, you will get to keep your own rulers, you'll act semi-independently, but under the rule of the Persian king. So basically submitting without the need for violent and horrific conquest. Arguably a good deal. Now this version on the screen, I don't know if you want to pause it and just have a quick look, takes a slightly different approach. Whereas the previous one was chronological, going in order from Cyrus to Xerxes, this one takes a kind of more strong argument based approach. You start with what you think are the most compelling argument, and that's a good way to start this kind of paragraph. The most compelling argument that the Persians treat the people they conquered well was. So we start with Cyrus because this kind of question is basically very Cyrus heavy. We know, according to Herodotus, he's very good to the people he conquers. So we carry on with Cyrus, we move into Darius and Xerxes, but what's different here is I've put Cambyses right at the end. Now, not because I don't think this is a valid point, but as we've said on the previous plan, it's only one source that suggests Cambyses was good to the people he conquered, particularly the Egyptians. Now, with this kind of question, there is a tendency clearly to start talking about reliability of the evidence, reliability of the source, the fact that it's only this guy who mentions Cambyses being good, and arguably he was in the employ of Cambyses and the Persian state, so he may well be biased, but you don't necessarily need to assess the quality or the nature of the evidence here. There's no marks for AO3 in this question, but what I've done here is I've used Cambyses at the end because this one example leads nicely into the next side of the argument, the counter-argument, which takes the more traditional view that Cambyses was generally unpleasant to the Egyptians following the death of the Apis bull, which fits into the whole madness of Cambyses thing. There is no right way to organise these arguments. It will ultimately depend on what the question is and how you feel about the question. But these are two different ways to approach it. Chronologically, it's probably easier to organise in your head, but in this one with judgment led, the most compelling argument first, and then working down to this one example we see for Cambyses. So this counter-argument you see on the screen now, this fits in nicely with this kind of importance approach. So we've gone from Cambyses being good, according to Horosnet, to starting our next section, clearly a new paragraph, starting with Cambyses, according to Herodotus, was not very pleasant at all. We can talk about his treatment of the Apis bull and his laughing at Egyptian religion, his desecration of graves, his treatment of particularly the royal family, the son and the daughter of the king, and what he did to them. So you've got plenty to go there, and ultimately we can say of the four kings, Cambyses is notoriously the least pleasant of the others. Moving on from Cambyses, we can also look at Darius, and it's a slight variation, but it's still a valid point that not necessarily those he initially conquered, but the treatment of those who oppose him. So straight away with the Behistun inscription, we see his treatment of the 9 kings, those who rebelled against him when he comes to power. So we've got gory detail saying he cut someone's nose off, his tongue out, put out his eyes, cut out his ears, put him on display for a bit, and then impaled him. Certainly not very pleasant. It's worth pointing out at this point, though, that Darius seems to take vengeance quite personally. He doesn't do this to all the people involved in these rebellions, it's the individual kings. A second development to take this idea of Darius's treatment of truth and liars, those who stand against him, comes with the Ionian Revolt. So at the end of the Ionian Revolt we see the sacking of Miletus. Interesting that this is a process or an idea that Cyrus had scrapped, but Darius brings it back to make a point. He enslaves the women and children, he enslaves the men. We're also given contradictory statement that he slaughters the military age men. Either way, Miletus does not benefit at all from Darius's rule at this point. Neither do Naxos, the island that was linked to the start of the Ionian Revolt. So when he sends troops to Greece, on the way there they stop at Naxos, they burn it to the ground, and similarly Eretria, they have a short siege before someone lets them in, they burn that to the ground. You could throw in a little counterpoint here that on his way to Greece, the Persian forces also stop at Delos, the sacred site of the birth of Apollo, and they do nothing. They have a little prayer, they leave some offerings, and they're on the merry way. So you could throw that in on either side of the argument just to make sure you're showing some balance. And then when we get to Xerxes, your obvious point would be that he burns Athens twice. Although he doesn't technically conquer the Greeks, we get a similar idea about what he's going to do should he take all of Greece, or should he take Athens and Sparta, the two city-states that really stood against him. And last but not least, we've got, well, Cyrus, but there's not an awful lot you can say for Cyrus. According to the sources, he's very nice, he's very pleasant, he's quite forward-thinking in his treatment of those he conquers. If you really wanted, if you were clutching at straws, you could talk about not necessarily Cyrus, but the reaction of the Mesogetai right towards the end of Cyrus's life, and how viciously they fight back, fearing Persian conquest, which you could suggest points out that maybe Herodotus isn't telling us the whole story, that maybe they've heard rumour of terrible things done by Cyrus, but these have mainly been swept under the carpet. Either way, with this kind of question, you can see it's not necessarily balanced, and it doesn't have to be perfectly balanced. You've got a strong argument on one side, say yes, the Persians did treat the people well, and you've got some example on the other side, say, well, no, they weren't particularly nice to these people, and these people. That's fine, because obviously your conclusion to this argument would lead you down the line that, on the whole, the Persians were nice, or they did treat the people they conquered well. Not entirely, not consistently, not all the way through, but for the most part, this was the case. So again, yeah, there's not an example to look at here, partly because for the length of this answer, it'd be far too much to just shove on a little screen, and no one wants to hear me read out someone else's answer. There are sample assessment answers on the OCR website. These come with examiner commentary. If you're not sure and you really want to drill into the examples of how to do this, go on the OCR Ancient History website. It's easy, just Google GCSE Ancient History, look for the candidate style responses. But as we've said with the 15 mark question, this really is where you need to start taking ownership of these arguments. I can't tell you the exact structure to use. Because you're being assessed on the quality of your argument, you need to really start thinking about how you're going to construct these things. And again, this really is the time where your actual teacher is incredibly invaluable. Anyone can learn content over and over again, but it's the improvement of the essay, writing them, practicing them, getting them marked and getting them back, but then importantly acting on the actions and improving them. This is where your teachers are absolutely irreplaceable. and far more valuable, like I said, than some weirdo on the internet. And now onto an example from the Foundations of Rome paper. Here we have it. It's to what extent did the demand for plebeian rights change in the early Roman Republic between 494 and 440 BC? Now this is a good example because it's a horrible question. I absolutely hate this question. And there's good reason why. The first issue I have with this question, why I'm glad it was on a spec and not a live paper, is because the question itself can be quite easy to misunderstood. You've got to read the questions carefully. So this question is not actually asking you about the changes to plebeian rights. It's not asking, did things get better, did things get worse? But it's asking about the demand for plebeian rights. So it's asking, ultimately, how did what the plebeians asked for and how they asked for it, how did that change? So it requires you, again, with this very small time period, it requires you to have some very specific knowledge, some very fine understanding of these particular events. The other thing as well is it focuses entirely on the, well, almost universally least popular part of the course. The early Republic period of the course lacks some of the kind of the narrative and the flair of the earlier Seven Kings. It can be quite dry and dogged. It doesn't help that there's a lot of people with the same name, a lot of repeating events. So this is quite a tricky question. And like I said, before we even get into the content side, it's reading the question that can really bring you unstuck here. If you write about how plebeian rights changed, technically you're not addressing the question. So read the question carefully. So let's have a look at what kind of bodge and scarper job I've done of this question. So same plan structure, exactly the same. Introduction, pretty formulaic. Address the issue, restate the question, point out roughly where this is going. So on the agree side, did the demands change? So we've got some examples. So the first one I've started with is the treatment of veterans after the various wars of independence. Particularly the example would be after the Battle of Lake Regillus. We've got the issues of debt, and you've got the old man looking all weary and tired, even though he's a great military veteran. The issue of plebeian debt comes to the fore. So this is the first demand. This is where I point out the first major change in demand. The issue is debt relief. Moving on from that, then we've got the various secessions that also bring different arguments for change in plebeian rights. In each case, in each of the secessions, there are specific grievances. So again, we've got the issue of war debt for the first secession. That's one of the key drivers. Later on, we get the issue that the tribunes are actually not very useful. The plebeians see them as not being that helpful to their cause. So that's a big change. What they're actually demanding and how they're demanding are slightly different. And again, the third point, we've got changing criticisms of the development. So initially, again, this kind of condenses this idea of the changing demand. So initially they have no representation, that the plebeians just do what they have to do. They ultimately do more than the patricians when it comes to sacrificing themselves during war. So they have no representation. Then they're given the tribunes of the plebs, who, as we've seen through various instances, become pretty ineffective. So again, the demand changes. The plebs demand greater representation, that this system that's been introduced does not work for them. Then we get the decemvirates, who again start off pretty well. This is a reaction to plebeian demands, but again, over time they become effectively a useless body, and even slipping into rule by tyranny according to some patricians. So we see the changes in demands throughout these three examples: demands over war debt and any kind of representation, then a change to develop the tribunes because what's been put in place doesn't work, and then finally a demand to change the decemvirates, which again fail to address the need that the plebeians have. And then on to the disagree side, your counter argument. And again, rather than going chronologically, you can argue the agree side was broadly chronological. We've gone, this side of the argument fits more with the kind of judgment-led article, so it's fine to mix and match your approaches on different sides. So the first and obvious point is that the plebeians never actually gained political or economic equality or even rights. And one thing that doesn't change is the plebeian demand for a better crack of the whip. They're constantly asking for parity with the patricians and a bit of fairness, so that doesn't change. The next point I've gone on to, the developments introduced by the Senate and patricians, were little more than plasters on gaping wounds. And at each point, even though the patricians and the Senate introduced different bodies, like the tribunes, like the decemvirates, even the 12 tables, even though they introduced these things, these are piecemeal attempts. The patricians are not willing to give the plebeians equality or a fair access to government. So that effectively does not change. They're constantly asking for parity. They're constantly given a token gesture of a reform. Third thing that doesn't change, again, is ultimately that the plebeians are continually called on to do more, give the most for limited reward, or in some cases, no reward, just crippling debt. So regardless of whatever systems are introduced, whatever reforms are introduced, the plebeians are not actually in much of a better state. They have some increase in rights and freedoms, but it's very, very limited. So very similar to point 2, but linking it clearly to this idea. Particularly a good example is the Wars of Independence. The plebeians are still called upon to sacrifice more. And the final point is that you can say, well, despite all this change, power never really moved away from a few key patrician families. The Claudiuses, the same families keep cropping up over and over and over again. It's almost like there's an aristocracy, an aristocratic patrician elite that are clinging on to all of the key roles. That the tribune of the plebs is an ineffective body because they're not plebs. That the plebs still have no argument or no say in government, and it's effectively this small aristocratic group who hold all the power. That does not change. If you wanted to be, just as a final point, if you've got time and room in your head to do this, you could make the point that actually this does not change right throughout the Roman period. The Republic is dominated by a certain few key families, the kind of aristocratic patricians, and then when you get into the imperial period, it becomes dynastic, that certain patrician families continue to rule absolutely, and the plebs get, well, nothing right throughout. So ultimately that feeds into your conclusion. Yes, the demands did change, but the root of all of these demands, fundamentally, the demands for more equality, more rights and representation, does not change. It's just how they ask for them, the specific mechanisms, the specific reforms that are being criticised. These are the things that changed. What doesn't change is this ongoing demand for rights and representations, because the plebs still feel that they are being put upon, which they are. So time for a quick recap. Question 5, 20 mark exam question, 5 marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar. Try and limit it to, first of all, 20 minutes. Don't forget you've got a whole other section to do after this, so don't think this is the end of the exam. 20 minutes, 5 bonus marks for spelling, punctuation and grammar. Next thing, do a plan. A quick plan, a short plan, but organise your arguments. Make sure you know what you're going to write about. Try and limit the amount of waffling you do. Your plan then should try and balance your argument, agree with the statement, disagree with the statement. The mark schemes say you don't necessarily have to take this approach as long as you acknowledge and arguably dismiss the counter argument, but it's generally a good idea to try and present some balance. Because you're being marked on the quality of your own argument, you do need an introduction, you do need to come to a judgment. This is ultimately what they're looking for. It should be well supported. And last, wherever relevant, try and cover the period stated. If it doesn't state a period, so for example with the Persians, cover as much of the 4 Persian kings as you can. If it does give you a time frame, stick within that time frame, as with the kings of the foundations of Rome example. Don't start talking about the kings and the various reforms made by Romulus. It's irrelevant. But again, even within that small period, try and cover the breadth of what went on. So there you have it, a very quick, well, probably not as quick as you'd like, a quick overview of how to address the 20-mark essay questions on the period exam paper. Hopefully this has been useful. Hopefully it will give you some guidance and idea how to approach these questions. As always, leave us a comment below, and until next time, goodbye.